The wizard is probably my favorite class in this game, until the commander releases. At that point, it'll probably have some worthy competition, but till then, the wizard's my favorite. I am the kind of player who loves always having the right answer to anything that the GM throws at us. I love being the person that tells the GM, nope, you can't do that, or telling the whole party that I have some weird, esoteric way of dealing with something that would otherwise have doomed us all. Most of all, I love battlefield control spells. In some ways, the wizard is literally designed for me to play, and yet, I kinda hate its design. Hello everyone, welcome to Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome and I hope you're here to stay. If you've been here before, welcome back and thank you for your continued support. The wizard is sort of one of the most divisive classes in Pathfinder. And it's not unique to Pathfinder. This problem of it being divisive has been in other editions of D&D and in Pathfinder 1st edition, so it's not unique to 2nd edition Pathfinder either. For one, you'll find that the wizard is often blamed as one of the big sources of the martial caster disparity. You can see this very easily even today in 5th edition D&D discussion forums, where a lot of the problem spells that make martials feel like they're not doing anything often come from the wizard. Then there's the fact that there's world-changing spells like teleport, simulacrum, clone. Pretty much any world-changing spell that's not resurrection magic is available to the wizard. So when people complain about this, they're largely complaining about this one person who kind of gets to have all of them. And then there's the fact that wizards have a pretty obnoxious power level in older editions, where with enough preparation and enough tactical play, they can kind of beat any reasonable encounter that the GM can throw at the party. And the GM cannot just arbitrarily up the challenge because that's unfair to all the players not playing a wizard. In 2nd edition Pathfinder, wizards are divisive in a very different way. A lot of these complaints are almost reversed. Some people think there's a caster-martial disparity. They think the wizard is a little too weak, that it's not rewarded enough for preparing in Pathfinder 2nd edition. Some say the wizard is too bland, and that it just doesn't have any class fantasy going for it. And often these complaints get hyperbolized as, oh, maybe Paizo just hates wizards. Maybe Paizo designers just didn't like GMing for wizards in 1st edition, and so they nerfed them into the ground. Obviously, that's hyperbole, and I don't think any of the commenters intend for that to be taken seriously. But the feeling is there that the wizard is too weak and the wizard is too bland. And with today's video, I'm hoping I can delve into a little more depth of why that both is and isn't the case. Now, to be clear, this complaint is not unique to Pathfinder 2nd edition. It shows up more commonly in discussion about 2nd edition because of the various balance changes and expectations brought with the game, but it's an old complaint. Weak wizards is as old a complaint as brokenly strong wizards, and how does that make any sense at all? Michael Sayre, the former game design manager at Paizo, has gone into details about this over on his Twitter. I will show you the full quote and link it in the video description. I'm not reading it word for word, but the general idea is that he compares the wizard in Pathfinder 1st edition to the Arcanist. The Arcanist was a simpler class that, when in the hands of a proficient player, was not going to do as well as a proficiently played wizard, and yet it was perceived as being stronger than the wizard. Lots of people perceive simplicity to be strength. That's the weak wizard's complaint. The bland wizard's complaint is also not unique to Pathfinder 2nd edition. Go over to a 5th edition D&D forum or a Baldur's Gate forum and you will find plenty of people saying, oh, wizards don't get class features. They don't really do anything. I want to play a sorcerer. Bland and weak can sometimes go hand in hand to people, but not always. So there are two distinct complaints. Although they often do go hand in hand, there is a tendency to perceive a stronger wizard as being less bland. Regardless, both of these are somewhat being inherited by 2nd edition. These complaints aren't actually new. They're just magnified in 2nd edition. So do wizards have a problem in this game? Well, I don't think wizards are too weak. I don't think they're too bland. I love the fantasy. And I definitely don't think Paizo just hates them. But wizards do have problems in this game. It's not like all of these are just people complaining about something that's not there. A lot of the points I build in this video will be built off of Michael Sayre's post from earlier, and I recommend checking out his Twitter for anyone interested in Pathfinder 2nd edition's design. My first major problem with the wizard's design is also ironically the thing I love about his design, but let's get into that. it has a confused class fantasy. It has inherited this idea of a Batman fantasy from older editions. And to some extent, this is a chicken and the egg problem. I don't know if all the way back in original D&D or advanced D&D, the wizard was, well, the magic user was intended to be a Batman kind of figure. Maybe it became so organically because of the way Vancian magic worked back in the day. Either way, today the wizard has inherited the mantle of being the Batman. And that is just a little bit outdated. I feel like it's a relic of old times. It is a fun fantasy for plenty of players, but I don't think it can be the defining fantasy for an entire class with a name as iconic as the wizard. When people say wizard, they're no longer thinking of somebody sitting with a book and being prepared for everything else. There are pieces of media with that kind of a fantasy. For example, say Moiraine from Wheel of Time will fit that fantasy pretty well. But then a lot of people don't picture Moiraine when they say wizard. They picture Gandalf, they picture Harry Potter. Now, I'm not saying that the wizard should be built entirely to cater to them, but the game does need to account for the fact that when somebody comes to play a TTRPG today, they're not going to want their fantasy to be defined from baggage that came 50 years ago. This is the source of a lot of major complaints about the wizard being bland. Plenty of people are not interested in the Batman fantasy. I don't think throwing the whole fantasy out is a good solution for this, because I like that fantasy, but there's probably a middle ground somewhere in there, and I'll get into this later. The second major problem with the wizard is it has a hellishly unforgiving skill floor. This is the consequence of two kind of opposing design goals. The first of these design goals is the wizard is always prepared and always playing tactically. But the second of these design goals is that Pathfinder 2nd Edition is intended to be a well-balanced game, so the wizard is balanced with everything else in the game. It cannot consistently and majorly outperform all the other options in the game. So you take the potential to be prepared, and the game has to expect you to be prepared, because if it didn't, it couldn't be balanced for you to be prepared at all times. Every caster suffers from this to some or the other extent in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, but none of them suffer as much as the wizard does. Every other spellcaster has ways to mitigate the downside of not having the right spells. Spontaneous casters obviously don't need to prepare the right spells every single day. Other prepared spellcasters, like the cleric, they have the healing font. Druids have incredibly strong focus spells. Witches have their incredibly strong hex cantrips and hex spells, and pretty good feats to go with all of this. It's the wizard who has somewhat obtuse ways of using their most important class feature, because Arcane Thesis is a very powerful feature, but quite hard to use. It's not really easing up your life. Like a cleric, when they see healing font, they're like, ah yes, my life got a lot easier with this. When a wizard sees Arcane Thesis, a lot of the time they go, huh? All of their power budget is invested into using spells very well, and using spells very well in conjunction with whatever Arcane Thesis you chose. And this makes the skill floor harsh and unforgiving. And at the ceiling, the wizard is balanced with everyone, but at the floor, it is genuinely one of the weakest classes in the game. My third and final problem with the wizard is that it fails to elevate players to the level of its class fantasy. If that doesn't immediately make sense, let me explain. Players are not their characters. You don't have to be charismatic to do really well as a bard. You don't have to be super strong, and nor can you be strong enough to grapple a dragon, to do well as a barbarian. But to play a wizard, you kind of need to be as tactical as a wizard. Other classes give you ways to elevate you to the level of fantasy that they're selling. For the bards, this is their composition cantrips and spells. These let you say that your bard is singing or dancing or giving a speech or whatever else, and that is boosting all your allies on the battlefield. You don't have to sing to make this work. It's not just charisma classes either. Investigators are an intelligence class, and they have a feature that lets you predict a role you'll be making in the future and then make decisions based off of that. They have ways of boosting recall knowledge, making it a free action, using it to give buffs to your allies. None of these things are free. Like the investigator's intelligence-based class fantasy still requires you to be fairly tactical to use it well, right? But the wizard kind of just gives you spells and expects you to use them well. It doesn't give you anything that elevates you, makes you feel like your character is a super genius. It gives you a very bare bones class chassis. Like I mentioned in the previous slide, one of the biggest class features wizards get is their arcane thesis, and the majority of them are quite hard to use. They actually make your life a little harder. Instead of making you feel like your wizard is super smart, you have to be really tactical to use it well. There are other classes with this problem in Pathfinder. Some would argue the alchemist has the same problem, but the wizards do have this problem, and that's what we're talking about right now. And of course, that does not mean the wizard's ceiling needs to be made easier to achieve. Not at all. I think it's good for games to have a variety of complex classes because plenty of people, including this math nerd right here, love tactical and complex classes. But that doesn't mean everyone who wants to play a wizard wants that. Even if most want that, it's okay for the wizard to appeal to everyone to some or the other extent. For example, the commander is a class with a lot of tactical depth and complexity. It's a playtest class, to be clear. It's not a class that's been released yet, but when you look at the playtest version, you can see that the commander has a lot of weird stuff going on. You can really make a complex character who has options for every single thing, both in and out of combat, with the commander fairly easily. But you can also just make a character who stands in place and uses the banner to make your friend use reactions to make attacks. And you'll have plenty of fun doing that. And wizards kind of lack that option. There's no way for the wizard to elevate you. You always have to elevate the wizard. Otherwise, you get a very poor skill floor, as I mentioned in the previous slide. So what's the solution here? I'm not just trying to criticize in a vacuum and not have some kind of solution. I want to suggest homebrew, I want to suggest third-party ideas, and maybe, fingers crossed, inform future design decisions of Pathfinder 3rd edition. The first thing is many of us like the Batman fantasy. Many of us like being paranoid and prepared at all times. So throwing the fantasy out simply isn't a good option in my opinion. There are many players who like the wizard. Paizo has even said that wizard, despite being divisive, is actually still very highly rated on that other side of divisive. It's not just poorly received. Lots of people think it's really good, and a lot of people think it's really bad. There is room for people who don't like the Batman fantasy to play the wizard, while also keeping the prepared paranoid genius as an option for those of us who like that fantasy. There's no reason to throw out the entire fantasy just to make room for the other. Now, some may say maybe the wizard needs a power level buff. If it's weak, just give it an across-the-board buff, right? A common suggestion I've seen is giving the wizard a +2 to their spellcasting DC so that they're like the basic spellcaster mirror to the fighter's basic warrior. I think solutions that buff the wizard's power level are a terrible idea. For example, that +2 DC will just mean that as a GM, in the hands of an experienced player, you'll see the wizard is able to shut down your encounter so much more easily than before. It'll make a lot of difference. If you haven't experienced this, even a +1 to the wizard's DC can make a lot of difference. So I don't think that is a good solution either. And this is where I'm going to introduce Wizards Plus, a third-party solution for the wizard class with plenty of homebrew options made by Teams Plus. There is a discount code in the description if you wish to use it, but please stick around for the rest of the video because I just want to gush about this product. I was part of the entire playtest process, and I honestly feel like the developers understand the wizard and understand Pathfinder, and I think this is one of the best solutions I've seen to improve the wizard that hits all three of those points with a precise knife, rather than hitting the wizard as a whole with a sledgehammer and then breaking the game in the hands of an experienced player. While covering the Wizards Plus book, I wanted to show you a few examples from this book about how they hit all three of the major points I touched upon. Obviously, these points somewhat blend into one another. Some of these things I show you will address multiple points, but I'll keep this in this structure to kind of keep the symmetry going. The first feat I want to show you is Stroke Chin. It's a very thematic feat where your wizard sits there and thinks like this, like a nerd. When you make a recall knowledge check, you can use a reaction to grant yourself a +2 circumstance bonus to the check, and you cannot critically fail this check and get false information. Simple, effective, and very on brand. One other thing to like about this feat is that it isn't out of line with things a well-designed wizard character in this game could already achieve. For example, when I made my nerd wizard, I took Knowledge Domain Cleric to get the Scholarly Recollection Focus spell to make my recall knowledge really, really good. But a wizard should not have to multi-class to do good recall knowledge. You're supposed to be the magical nerd. And having a feat that is roughly on the power level as existing options, perhaps even a little weaker, but competing with those options and being more thematic than those options is a win. And this is exactly what I mean when I say the class needs to elevate your character fantasy for you. Here's another example, the Impart Learning feat. After an encounter while exploring, you can somehow link lessons learned in that encounter alongside weird observations about magic to the next thing your allies want to do. Your ally is going to search for something, for example, search for hidden traps. Somehow you will notice their lack of observation skill in the previous encounter and aid them using Arcana for their search. Incredibly thematic, and it kind of speaks to the wizard fantasy where you expect the wizard to kind of be saying cryptic statements that nobody else at the table understands, which would be kind of obnoxious if you as a player did it. But it's great that your character can do this for you. There are plenty of other thematic and cool feats in this book, and like I said, they do a really good job of being in line with the power level of everything else while just being incredibly thematic. There's a feat to study your spellbook to figure out weaknesses in the enemy you're facing, but it makes you off guard while you're doing it, and it costs actions to do so. And it's just all around a very thematic feat. There's even Sacred Geometry, which I'll link in the description, which is the most obnoxious feat in Pathfinder 1st edition, and it's incredible in this book. It's very thematic, very confusing, but not going to slow down your play. This is everything I mean when I say the class needs to elevate your play experience. The next part is easing up the skill floor for you. There are many ways in which this book eases the skill floor for wizards, including new schools, new theses, but one of my favorite ones is this new trait called Exploit. I'm not going to link the full text of this trait for you, but the general idea is Exploit feats give you a way to convert a spell slot into something else that is more generically usable if the situation you prepared the spell slot for didn't come up. These ways are usually a reaction or a 3-action way of doing so. I'll show you an example. This is the Force Disruption exploit. The cost of this feat is expending a force spell like Wall of Force or a spell that boosts your AC in some way. Instead of doing what the spell would have normally done, you can use this as a mini blast with a little bit of force movement attached. This can be a reaction you do, almost like a reactive strike, when someone moves near you, which can then push them away and make your life a little easier, or you can use it as a 3-action crowd control plus damage spell. Little things like this that give you ways to not suffer the downside of poor preparation, the downside of the GM just not throwing the encounters you were expecting at you, go a long way towards raising up the skill floor of the wizard, because the wizard's hardest aspect is figuring out how to prepare spells in a way that you feel efficient and powerful every single day. On the days you make mistakes, this will feel better. The more mistakes you make, the better this will feel, but this is not going to do something to make the player who was already really good at playing the wizard become obnoxiously good. This is exactly what I mean at raising the skill floor without raising the skill ceiling. And finally, we talk about the point I had earlier about the class fantasy of the wizard, the Batman fantasy being kind of choking the wizard out of other options. All the schools, theses, and feats that I've mentioned all together make for a more cohesive class fantasy for people who don't want to do the same prepared wizard class fantasy that many of us like. And more importantly, they do so in a way that addresses the skill floor and the lack of player elevation that I mentioned in my previous few slides. They do it in a way where you don't feel like you're punished for not being the always prepared, always paranoid, mad genius wizard. I'm going to mention my favorite of these, but I do have to emphasize this is far from the only one. This is a thesis called Rudimentary Perfectionism. The idea of the thesis is simple. You're a nerd. Every wizard is a nerd. But you are a gatekeeping nerd. You're the kind of nerd who looks at the other wizards and says, it's not cool to use Eclipse Burst. I use the old ways. I want to heighten a fireball to be as good as Eclipse Burst. And then this thesis lets you do that. When you heighten a spell, It either gains a status bonus to the damage or healing you do equal to the number of ranks you heightened it, or twice that if you cast it from a spell slot. So all your cantrips will gain a bunch of damage because they automatically heighten with you, as will your focus spells, and then any spells you heighten will gain more damage. For example, if you take a Fireball, which is a 3rd rank spell, and heighten it to 6th rank, it will deal +6 damage, which means it will actually keep up with the AoEs that normally would have outscaled it by now. There are many other things in this book that sell these cohesive class fantasies. There's something called Deliberations, where you trade away your Arcane Bond feature and instead get something that makes you good at a skill that is not traditionally seen as wizardly. For example, Deception. And then you can use that deception and weave it into your magic to make people have some sorts of penalties to the saving throws that you make them do. There's an Elementalist thesis. There's a Gunner thesis. There's just so much going on. There's even a class archetype to build a wizard who can, in a limited manner, pull other traditions of magic. All of these go so deep into expanding the class fantasy of the wizard. Anyways, that's enough fanboying from me about Wizards Plus. Like I said, there is a discount code in the video description that you can click on to get 15% off on this product. I hope I convinced some of you to buy it. I have to emphasize that I was part of the playtest process for this. I volunteered to share this product with y'all because I just find it incredible. I think it addresses so many of the complaints I have with the wizard. That'll be all for today. Let me know if you like this sort of video. I've been thinking about doing a series where I just muse on the design of Pathfinder 2nd Edition and perhaps even other TTRPGs that I have experience with. If this video is a hit, you'll see more of that in the future. Until then, please like, comment, and subscribe. I'm happy to hear any discussion points that you may wish to bring up. I'm happy to hear if you have anything to share about Wizards Plus that I may have missed. Till later.